Ladies and gentlemen, we are very lucky to have as our penultimate session today the great Professor Ruby Lal, who has pioneered over the last 20 years a lost history of Mughal women. As you're aware, many people have the preconception that Islamic societies are endlessly and impenetrably patriarchal, and that women in Islam in all periods have always been oppressed. Ruby's work has done a great deal to nuance and modify that solid position. First of all, with an extraordinary book on the Mughal Harem, which busts a whole variety of myths coming from a number of different quarters, both European Orientalist myths and sort of Hindu fundamentalist myths about the place of Mughal women, and going back to an incredible range of primary sources to show that it ain't necessarily so, that the women in the Mughal harem could, in certain circumstances, be remarkably powerful individuals and with a great deal of agency. And she's followed this up after a book on girlhood with an extraordinary one-person test case, so to speak, the extraordinary figure of the Empress Nur Jahan, who was not just the wife of the Emperor Jahangir, but his co-sovereign, a uniquely powerful woman in this extraordinary moment, and celebrated as such on coins and in many other official documents. Ruby, maybe just start off by painting a picture for us, for those of us who don't know this world well, a little portrait, word portrait of Mughal India towards the end of the Emperor Akbar's reign, around 1600 or...
Thank you. Thanks, William. It's an honor to do this with you. You've been a pioneer yourself in thinking about, taking Mughals to every bookshelf in the world. So, this is wonderful.
I should make one little personal family thing. One member of my family, James Drimple, in Hyderabad in the 1780s, married a woman called Muti Begum, who was a Mughal noble lady, the daughter of the Nawab of Masulipatam. And this appears right at the back of my book, White Mughals. And in an interview to the Hindu newspaper in Madras, when the book came out, I talked about this lady and her marriage to the Nawab Masulipatam. The following morning, at 7 in the morning, my hotel telephone started ringing. I groggily picked it up, and Nawab Masulipatam here. And he said that the family was descended from one of Nur Jahan's sisters. So I have a distant family connection to this story.
So he was, as I was destined to write this book, he was destined to talk to me about this. So to the 1600s, I do want to take a few minutes to say a few words even about before the 1600s and on to the 1600s. When we think of the Mughals of India, we think classically the Taj Mahal, but we also think palaces and grandeur and wealth and what have you. The critical point in thinking the Mughals for the time that we are talking about, but also I think really centrally as far as women's power is concerned, is a pre-nation time. And by that, I mean very specifically, obviously, that there were no firmed up territories, there were no fixed lands, but even more critically, people moved. Migration was very much a part of the character of not only Central Asia and Afghanistan and on to Al-Hind or the land beyond the river Indus, but really for much of the world. So with all its ferocities and problems of experimentation, it was a time in which artists moved. They moved with beautiful stories, many different kinds of languages, many different ways of being, but also once they got on to other lands, the experimentation and playfulness continued. So I really do want to put this out here in order to suggest that Akbar actually is the first Mughal king after Babur and Humayun, his father, who begins historically the detailed process of institutionalization, bureaucratization, extensive campaigns in much of northern India, but alongside critically establishing cities. All of this doesn't reduce the fact that he continues to move, as did most of the Mughals, but he mostly moved for war and for capture and for campaigns and
Ruby,
so on. So
maybe go back, assuming that a Boulder audience maybe not even be sure who the Mughals are at all. So who are the Mughals? 1600, what is India like? Who is Akbar? Where does he come from?
So the Mughals go back a long way to the almost mythic ancestors Tamerlane, Timur, and Genghis Khan. And it's a variety of familial lines that are an offshoot from these two progenitors that really rule pretty much most of Central Asia, Afghanistan, and have connections in Iran. And Babur, the first Mughal, covets Samarkand, Timur's land, forever. He captures it for a little while, loses, establishes himself in Afghanistan, and then looks to, as he calls it, Al-Hind, or the land beyond the river Indus. And in 1526, he establishes, he defeats Ibrahim Lodi of Delhi at that point, and has an early foothold. And so begins this journey of the Mughals into establishing a new home, experimenting with a population that is multi-confessional, which is Hindu, Jains, Parsis, Buddhists, and Muslims. I mean, Muslims had been in India for a very long time, and the earliest historically that we can establish are from the seaboard areas of India, contemporary India, via mysticism, via trading networks, and so on. So to come back to then Akbar again, with these cities, he becomes a great experimenter. He's a very playful guy. I mean, he has these amazing assemblies every Thursday night in which he has conversations with all sorts of heads of varieties of faiths. He does all of this.
This is Akbar rather than
This
Babur.
is Akbar. We need to come to Akbar, so I came back to Akbar. He's the first man who establishes, not only builds the first sandstone harem in Fatehpur Sikri, the red sandstone harem. This had been a whole family that lived in tents. And by tents, I don't mean a two-room tent, but we are really talking about hundreds of thousands of people, whole cities that were on the move, with practices of respectability for women and some form of separation in that these were homosocial spaces, so men and women. But it's for the first time, not only are these palaces built, but women are really declared in the Aine Akbari as the Pardegyan, or the veiled ones. So it's a huge charge against.
And these sandstone buildings are often sort of stone tents themselves, aren't they? With metal rings for further awnings. So they were partly tented.
Yes.
Sort of tent struts, in a sense.
That's right. I mean, essentially, in the nomadic world, the tents were made of trellis. And trellis is a very strong waxed. It's a combination of different kinds of things that really protects you from a variety of weather conditions. We are talking about tented structures, and we are talking about palaces because there's a deep implication of where we live to what happened to women in this history. So we really wanted to lay this out for you.
And again, just lay a picture of the position of Mughal women by the time of Akbar. For example, Babur's sister, Khanzada Begum, had been an extremely powerful figure sorting out disputes among the men. Mm-hmm. What were the sort of things that a powerful Mughal matriarch could do?
So a variety of things. These women moved, and that is my first book I wrote in order to really rethink this whole idea of a sexualized harem in which women just laid about, I'm wearing harem pants, by the way, but they were nothing called harem pants. Laid about, holding grapes, awaiting the monarch for his pleasure. Now, pleasure is all really, a great thing, and I think it's wonderful to be playful and pleasurable, but not just simply in the interest of the king. So these were lively, incredibly bold, marvelous, agential women. William just referred to Khanzade Begum, who was the sister of Babur, the first Mughal, who makes this so-called promise of getting into marriage with his most ardent enemy in Uzbekistan, a man called Shaybani Khan, in order to constitute peace between the two of them. And then eventually she comes back to Babur. But the woman I really want to talk about as the, let's say, the progenitor of Nur Jahan was a woman called Gulbadan Banu Begum, Princess Rosebody. The only woman, not only in the entire Mughal dynasty, but also of the Safavids of Iran, Ottomans of Turkey, but the entire Islamic belt of this time, the only woman who wrote an account in prose. Now, this is a really interesting document. The only copy we have is in the British Library.
One copy of it.
The only one copy in the library, but I think there's more to this story, which is that when the Akbarnama, as part of this ferocious and ambitious establishment of the empire, all the things that I've been talking about by way of Akbar, one of the things he did was to say that we are going to have the first official history of the empire that has to be written. It came to be called the Akbarnama, which is a stupendous account of everything about the emperor and his marvelous feats. It also has a 3-volume compendium, a gazetteer called the Aine-Akbari, which has statistics, measurements, calculations of everything that you can imagine about the Indo-Gangetic plain, ranging from agrarian to taxes, to perfumes, to flowers, to hills,
pigeons.
To mountains.
Wonderful section on pigeons.
And pigeons, and horses, and tents, and ceremonies. I mention this because as part of the writing of the Akbarnama, some senior servants and members of the household were invited to write. And there was one woman amongst them, this woman, Gulbadan Banu Begum, invited to write. She's the senior aunt of the emperor by this time. So what she writes was not what everybody wrote, which is great is the king, great are his feasts, amazing armies and occupations and what have you. She wrote about what historians over time called the soft society of women. That is about childbirth, about negotiations, women fighting with the monarchs for visiting their mothers or aunts, constant negotiation. But the power of the document is that it really is a document about migration, the making, history as it was unfolding. She was born in Afghanistan, and she comes to India with Babur. She is Babur's daughter at age 3. She goes into exile during the time of Humayun when he goes to Persia for 10 years. So this is a woman who witnesses a lot. And I'll say the last thing about her. When Akbar builds the harem, she gathers together 13 senior-most women of the royal family and says to Akbar in the language in which he'll understand, we are going to go on an all-women's pilgrimage to Mecca. She leads this pilgrimage like her memoir, the only all-women's pilgrimage that she takes. To begin with, it was a problem. When you go on a pilgrimage to the Hijaz, you are supposed to be accompanied by a male relative, a blood male relative, like your husband or by marriage, but your father or son. Akbar, of course, says to her, here's my 6-year-old son, Murad, he's going to accompany you. And of course, I can imagine her scoffing at him and said, no, we are not going to take him. But the more interesting thing is, they live in the Hijaz area on the Red Sea for 3.5 years. By the end of their stay, the Ottoman Sultan Murad III, and I've just been discovering these things. This is not in my first book. This is my next book. He issues 6 imperial decrees. Ottoman Sultan, under whose domain the Hijaz lay, in which he classifies their activities as un-Islamic. 13 matriarchs of the Mughal world doing un-Islamic activities. I mean, I think it is fabulous. This is the world we are talking about.
And so in general, so even before Nur Jahan has appeared on the scene, Mughal women are slightly outraging everybody by being sort of big, quite kick-ass.
Un-Islamic.
Yeah, kick-ass and Islamic.
Badass.
Badass. And this will continue later when the building of Delhi, when half of it is built by women.
That's right.
And compared to, say, Isfahan, where women do the odd sort of tomb or a caravanserai or something.
Right.
But there's a survey of the difference in patronage between Isfahan and Shah Jahanabad, 2
right.
parallel cities, and Mughal women have got a lot more power.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
So this is the scene in which, so paint the thing. So Akbar is coming towards the end of his reign. This restless young Prince Salim, who's been arguing with his dad, who's gone off and a semi-rebellious, moved his own little court to Allahabad. And in the middle of all this, this woman turns up. Paint the picture. So,
she doesn't just turn up. She's the
drum roll.
she's the daughter of the great Ghiyas Beg, the great noble, who comes to Akbar the Great's court in the late 1570s from Iran, out of a range of factors: religious persecution, Shah Tahmasp, who was his employer. He dies, he runs into debt, so a range of things happen, and they leave in an imperial caravan.
Are they Sunni or Shia? They're Shia.
We'll say culturally Shia for now,
Right.
and then I'll say more later.
Okay.
And Nur Jahan is born on the road in just outside Kandahar in Afghanistan, and then they come to India. So she grows up. Her father is employed by Akbar the Great, and she grows up in these surroundings. She's raised there. At some point, certainly they come to Fatehpur Sikri, but when Fatehpur Sikri is abandoned, they'll have gone to Agra. The legends are of an affair between this restless Salim and Mihirun Nisa, and he was passionately in love with her. And there's a lovely old legend that's actually to be found in a 19th century Urdu book that's replicated over and over again. If I may just read that legend, which all the people that I talked to, both in India and Afghanistan, brought out this legend in some form or another. It was not always the same, but let me just tell you what this legend is. Speaking of pigeons, actually. In the prime of his youth, Mughal Emperor Jahangir, then Prince Salim, strolled into a garden. He'd just been to the Meena Bazaar, the renowned market in the capital, where royalty and nobility wandered among merchants, displaying the curiosities of the world. Jahangir had a pair of invaluable pigeons in his hands. He saw a flower that he wanted to pluck, but his hands were not free. Just then a young woman passed by. Asking her to hold on to the pigeons, he turned to pluck the flower. On turning back to the woman, he saw that she had only one pigeon in her hand. He asked about the other. She replied, "Your Highness, it has flown away." "How did that happen?" the astonished prince asked. She stretched her hand, loosened her grip, and let the second pigeon go, like this. She said. The prince was stunned. He lost not only his rare pigeons, but his heart as well. And this comes from Muhammad Hussain Azad in the 19th century. He says this is from credible, elderly generations. So these are the stories we hear of Salim and Mihir's passionate love affair, and there are many of these.
Again, let's slow down. Let's get a little picture of Jahangir as a young man, young Salim.
The young Salim was the Salim that you don't meet as the emperor? So it's a very good question. He revolts against Akbar the Great's indomitable power. He establishes an alternate court in Allahabad, actually a very important court for painterly experimentation.
He brings Govardhan and quite a lot of the major
Abul
painters.
Hassan,
Yeah.
and all of these famous painters.
So he's competing with his dad not just as in terms of power, but in terms of aesthetic refinement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then he becomes actually, as emperor, interestingly, he emerges as the classic prince figure, out of this experimentation. But in patching differences between him and his dad, it's Gulbadan Begum, we've already talked about her, Salima Sultan Begum, who was Akbar's elderly wife, who was the former wife, actually, of his regent, Behram Khan. These two women become very central in...
But again, someone who's slightly in the shadow of his father. His father's been the great conqueror, the great establisher of rules. And initially, Prince Salim is a slightly disappointing son. He fails to bring the women up to Kashmir. His first job he's given is to take the women of the harem and deliver them safely to Srinagar on the summer holiday. And he screws up.
And he screws up, yes.
And he's terribly apologetic. He goes and sulks in his tent. And so his early life, he's not a success. He's not a...
But it's also, it's very interesting to imagine Akbar the Great as your father.
Yeah,
right?
I mean,
So,
impossible act to follow.
yes, but actually he does become an interesting figure following his accession in that he really, in some senses, goes against the very ethics of hardcore and kind of indomitable governance that Akbar, sets in place.
Is there a modern equivalent in modern American history? Is it like being JFK's son or something? Or what's the...
Well, I think these are rather different times. I mean, JFK's son is not going to have two cranes that he's going to follow every day and, employ a eunuch. And so he does use his father's, established grandeur, but then he builds on it in rather different ways.
And exactly like you're saying. So he's scientifically interested.
Yes.
He observes animals.
That's
He's
right.
rather like an Enlightenment gentleman, one of these
That's
sort of
right.
18th century figures, making scientific observations or something.
That's
but
right.
But 200 years before that, he puts up a sheep to watch it decay and measure
Yes.
the decay of a sheep in one place rather than another place.
That's
So
right.
like a sort of amateur scientist in all sorts of
Yes,
ways.
and Abercorn calls him the Francis Bacon in a way, and he's a naturalist. He really looks up to Babur, his great-grandfather, and the Jahangirnama, his memoir. And so it's very interesting. Akbar goes into having any number of histories of his empire written, and he goes against that and starts writing the Jahangirnama, which really becomes the official document of his reign.
And so again, just to get the Baburnama, the Babur's book, is a deeply personal diary where he admits
That's
to all
right.
sorts of things, including falling in love with young men.
Baburi.
Yeah, and meeting his beloved in the bazaars of Herat.
That's right.
Then you have Akbar, who's illiterate, but Abul Faisal writes this very pompous, remarkable but pompous, golden-tongued, toady-ish
Right.
official account where his,
We want to call it a panegyric.
a panegyric. That's the smarter word. But where the sun shines out of the emperor's
Head.
and then Jahangir goes against that and writes a personal diary again with
That's
all
right.
and in that, among other things, he records what's probably his greatest personal failing.
Achievement.
Oh. You do the achievement, I'll do the failing.
I want to switch to Nur Jahan, not to his alcoholism.
But he does record his alcoholism.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, copiously.
And measures his struggles. It's like he puts his own sort of personal Alcoholics Anonymous sort of confessional into it.
Well,
About how he used to drink 10 cups of triple distilled liquor. Now he's only on one
6.
glass of IPA or...
that's right. That's right. The thing the remark I'd like to make on drinking also, with all its problems understood, like Babur, it's a very important form of sociality. I mean, Babur chides Humayun for not drinking. He says to him in a letter, if you're not going to drink, how the hell are you going to bond? how are you going to build solidarities? I mean, you know what we call networking today.
Yeah.
So that's really what we are talking about in a
Humayun,
setting.
this son of Babur, who's the father of Akbar, this sort of hopeless hippie, who's always sort of throwing arrows up into the air, hoping they're going to come down and be able to measure his astrological chart and this sort of thing. And, yeah.
Yes.
Not at all the practical man that his father or his son is.
Well, I think there's need for rewriting. As with Jahangir, he's been junked as this, alcoholic and drugs, and therefore that becomes the explanation for the rise of Nur Jahan. Yes, he was an alcoholic, but that's not why she becomes the co-empress, something that we really should be talking about.
So let's move on. So she's arrived. So what point in Jahangir's life does Nur Jahan turn up?
So 1594 is when she marries the first time to an employer of the Mughal court, also an Iranian, a man called Ali Kuli, and they go to Bengal. And Bengal had just then been incorporated into the Mughal center. This is a very critical time for Nur Jahan, about who Jahangir writes copiously as an incredibly important shot of the empire. Not just killing birds, but killing killer tigers in order to save subjects. And everybody didn't have the right to hunt tigers. It was a sign of sovereignty in Islamic domains. So Bengal, the land of the Bengal tiger, I chart in the book the landscape, the rough character of the forestation and the movement of animals through it. Cooley's job will have demanded at least 2 constant visitations, one to Raj Mahal, which was then the capital of Bengal, and then to Agra. So constant respects to the governor and to the emperor. And the life that Nur Jahan will have built in Bardhaman, which is where they were, will be very different from Agra. It is a life in a mansion, but it's an isolated life where she'll have finessed that hunting, where she'll have finessed the thinking about center and state.
And what's the status of her first husband? He's a governor, or he's a minor knight?
He's a minor officer.
Right.
And I believe that they get married because, like Ghayas Beg, like her father, he runs from persecution in Iran and serves under what
variety of persecution?
Of what?
What sort of persecution?
Religious persecution. It's the same time that her parents leave, actually. And so I think there'll have been some affinity between her father and this young man, and so she's engaged to him. So the story about Bengal is that he gets involved in a plot to kill the emperor, Jahangir. And the governor hacks him to pieces. This is 1608, and Nur Jahan is brought back. Her father by this time is the prime minister of Jahangir. Her brother, older brother, is a great nobleman.
So there's some extent to which the first husband is not only below her status, but a huge disappointment. She comes from the prime ministerial stock, but she's married to some minor officer in Bengal.
That's right. I think they were rather different. If her upbringing is anything to go by, she came from a highly literate family. Her father was a man of letters who was a great artist of calligraphy, of poetry. Her mother is a vivacious presence in the records of the time, highly agile character herself. So Nur Jahan, who was also an amazing poet, apart from a fine architect, a trend-setting architect, was a very cerebral figure in a way. And she uses architecture, for example, in the interest of statecraft. We can talk about that later. And he was called the Tiger Slayer by Jahangir. First husband, who was not actually a tiger slayer, but that really, suggests something about the physical qualities of the man, and so rather different. And so there are some reflections I've made on this time. So anyhow, she comes to the harem in 1608, not to her father's house, and is put under the charge of the 3 senior-most women in the harem. One,
How old is she at this point?
She's 31.
Which is very old for a Mughal
For the
woman.
time.
Yeah.
And 3 years later, they meet in the Meena Bazaar, the same Meena Bazaar of the
With these pigeons.
Of the pigeons. No, it is not this story. It's
Right.
another story which is documented
Right.
in the thing. And then they get married. And this is 1611.
And Jahangir already has several wives.
He
at
has
this point.
19 wives. She is the 20th wife, daughter of a mother, widowed, his last wife, and very soon to be the co-sovereign.
So how does this 31-year-old, old by Mughal standards, who's had this rather low status marriage, but who is now the daughter of the Prime Minister, how does she manage to rise to this great height? Because you'd have thought that if she's not, I mean, a young Mughal woman would marry normally at 14, 15?
That's right.
And so, but 31, she's really quite an auntie by this stage. And
Yes. I think, yes, right. Okay.
But obviously not in the eyes of Jahangir.
That's right. How does she rise? So 1611, when they get married, this is where everything stops as far as we know about Nur Jahan, and by that I mean in fiction. There were 10 films that were made on her, all called Nur Jahan, between 1936 and 1967. There were 2 operas that were
Really?
made on her in the 1920s in England. Any number of fictional accounts in Bengali, Sindhi, Gujarati, Hindi, Urdu, of course, some in Persian, but everything stops at 1611. And I take on that 1611 onwards, also before, of course, in the book, as really when her life's best work begins. So there are 2 questions that came up again and again in the writing of this book, and the question that William is asking me, but also that I got asked repeatedly: how did she happen back then?
Only the 20th wife.
Only the 20th wife. I think the question is also how did she happen back then and in India? And here are and the answer to those 2 questions is this book. But I want to just share with you a few reasons of her happening. The incredible upbringing that we've been talking about, the incredible experience in the eastern provinces, which were like the Wild West, that we are talking about, which will have led to some amount of experimentation, some amount of thinking every day of how to be and how to live. And then coming to the harem under what were really dastardly circumstances. Her older brother was a suspect in the murder of the plot to murder the emperor. Her father had been held off for a year as the vizier, but then reinstalled in that position. And there were 19 amazing other wives. So what was it about Nur Jahan? Over time, we begin to see that there are a few people who coalesce around the emperor and the empress. Her father, the vizier, her older brother, Asaf Khan, her stepson, the future builder of the Taj Mahal, Shah Jahan, the emperor, and these amazing matriarchs. So the first evidence of actual exercise of the technical symbol of sovereignty comes around 1616, if we are going by textual documentation. In that she issues, so by this time, this is a very peripatetic couple that I want to turn back to.
Which year were they married?
1611.
So 5 years after the marriage is her first document.
Is the first document in the interest of preserving the land rights of a peasant. And she issues a imperial order, which is called a nishan, and it's a technical symbol of sovereignty, again, in Islamic law. And it has her stamp. There are 10 of these that survive, which are in Rajasthan. And the technical symbol is Nur Jahan Padshah Begum, literally Lady Emperor.
Already, 5 years in.
Only 5 years later, but I want to actually turn to the painting we were talking about yesterday, Could we have it up, please?
There she is.
This painting is in the Rampur Raza Library in UP. And I just want to speak about this for a few minutes. This was painted by Abul Hasan, the painter laureate, the greatest portrait maker of Jahangir's court, a man called Abul Hasan, Nadirul Zaman, the wonder of the age. And two things I want to say. One, before this painting, we have any number of paintings of Mughal women that are what we call in a Naika mode, that is beautified mode. So all the women look very similar. The only distinction that we can make is by way of their clothes or their jewelry or hats and gestures and so on. This is established by the great art historians such as Milo Cleveland Beach and others, that this painting was was made between 1612 and 17. 1612.
The early years of the marriage.
The early years of marriage, 1617. Either way, this is staggering. And why is she staggering? Because A, this is not in a beautified mode.
Nor in a
Two,
sexualized, remotely sexualized. Normally, Mughal women portraits have a quite
a beautified form.
Beautified, but also sort of quite décolletage and
Exactly
see-through,
right.
Buffed hawa, this very see-through outfits. But she's dressed like a man.
She's dressed like a man. Art historically, there's a rise of her breast. The feet have henna patterns. The waist is narrow. These are all things, apart from technicalities of the painting itself, that help us establish or that help the art historians establish that this is the Nur Jahan portrait.
And not a boy.
And what?
And not a boy, because it's quite
Yes. The critical thing here is that she is loading the musket. Sign of sovereignty with which my book begins. So the question is...
And a sign of, generally, of being kick-ass. That she's, you didn't
So,
necessarily...
so what was Abul Hasan thinking when he painted this? Because this is a stand-alone in his oeuvre, as is she a stand-alone in this dynasty.
This is almost sort of Bonnie and Clyde we have here. She's sort of, she's a woman with a gun. This is not a usual,
No,
this is unique.
in Islamic terms, this is fitna.
Yeah.
This is chaos, right? I do want to make 2 points. I want to remind ourselves that she was not from the Mughal family. We want to be very clear about this. She is the daughter of Ghayas Beg and Asmat Begum. So she is aristocratic, but not from the royal family.
And a foreigner.
And therefore?
A foreigner. I mean, her father's come in from Persia.
I think in the time, as you and I have been talking, there are some notions of foreignness, but you do have a highly complex system of, nobility in which you have Iranis, you have Duranis, you have people from Central Asia, and then the Hindustani Muslims that get involved, and Hindus, right? So I think it's a very wide complex.
So then you get these accounts of her by European travelers, which need to be taken quite cautiously, because the European travelers do not have access to court in the same way that many other sources do, and they're often. I mean, so for example, Thomas Rowe. What does he say? First British ambassador.
Thomas Rowe follows Noor and Jahangir's camp in Western India and writes journals. We do not know whether he actually met Jahangir, but we do know that when he finally got the permission to meet Jahangir, Nur Jahan kept his imperial seal overnight, and he was really pissed. And he wrote of her as the goddess of heathen impiety. At another point, he writes she was inaccessible as a goddess. But the interesting thing is, I want to take all sorts of chronicles with thought, with critical assessment. So there's been a tendency in scholarly writing simply to just junk the Europeans. But I think the Europeans were observing this world with very particular points of view, which were their own.
And you get different levels of observation.
Exactly.
Thomas Rowe's much closer than, say, Thomas Coriat, who's a vagabond on the edge of things,
Exactly.
picking up bizarre gossip. Thomas Rowe is in court.
Yes, that's right. I also think of a later, European who's also involved under the army kind of regimen, so to speak, of Nur Jahan's great-grandson Darashikoh, a man called Manucci, who was obsessed with Nur Jahan. And the way in which he writes about her birth outside of Kandahar is one of the most magnificent descriptions. Yeah. I'd like to actually read that to you in order to make the point of the complexity of these legends. So just take a minute here. So Manucci writes that he was amazed about the stories that, so he's writing some years after Nur Jahan. And most of all, he was taken by her moment of birth. So Manucci decided that the model for his narration of Empress Nur Jahan's, what he calls nativity, should be nothing less than the flight into Egypt, the famous story of Jesus' infancy, told in the Gospel of Matthew and employed as a potent motif by European painters of this time. So in Manucci's 1705, almost 50 years after Nur Jahan dies, Storia do Mughal, or History of the Mughals, here's what he writes. I was anxious to find out about the descent of this queen, and I came to know for a certainty that she was the daughter of a Persian who arrived from Persia as a camel driver in the service of some Armenian merchants. He brought with him his wife, who was enceinte, pregnant. On the way, near the fortress of Kandahar, she was delivered of a child. And one of the merchants lent him an ass on which to convey the woman in that state of distress. The child that was born in that miserable plight but came to be this famous Empress Nur Jahan. So the image of Gayas leading a donkey, bearing a pregnant Asmat, brings to mind the biblical passage in which Saint Joseph, fleeing the murderous King Herod, guides the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus to safety in Egypt. So the point here is that Manucci, a devout Catholic, was aware that this episode in the life of Jesus was well known in India. Not only the Jesuit visitors to the Mughal capital tell the story, but artists in the court of Jahangir had copied the engravings and woodcuts of Albrecht Dürer, including the flight into Egypt, which depicts the scene.
So let's go to her high period now. So she's married, she's issuing orders. What are the other things that she does that we hear of no other Mughal woman doing?
So she's a trend-setting architect, and I want to mention a couple of things which are really quite incredible. One is, after her parents die in 1622, she builds the mausoleum of her parents. It's the tomb of Itmaduddaulah across the river, on the banks of the Yamuna in Agra. It's called the Little Jewel Box, and it's an incredible design not only for the motifs and the plural motifs, which has any number of and kind of early makings of pietra dura, that is using flower engravings into what she uses for the first time in a mausoleum, that is marble. And this becomes the inspiration for the Taj Mahal. I mean, today it's called the use of marble and pietra dura. That's then taken to amazing heights. The thing is that, rickshaw pullers and other people around the tomb today call it the baby Taj, but that's anachronistic. I believe the Taj is the baby Taj. Mm-hmm. So that's an incredible attribute. This is not the only thing she builds. She's the first person to build the Noor Mahal Sarai in Jalandhar, which was, on the main highway for massive international trade. And according to...
In the Punjab.
In the Punjab, according to the estimates that the great Wayne Begley, no more with us, had made of the architectural remains of this building, at its height, it could house up to 4,000 people, including that many horses. The important architectural message of this building is that the facade survives. And on the outside of the facade, there are 4 lines of poems. The last line says, "This caravanserai was built by Nur Jahan Begum." Now, women had built things before, such as mosques, soup kitchens, other kinds of architectures, baulis, for instance. But nobody, we know this through architectural designs and methods used, that these may have been built by such and such and such and such. But it's for the first time she inserts her name onto an architectural building, something that her grandniece Jahanara then later on picks up in her use of the Friday Mosque in Agra.
We're running out of time now, so just give a picture again of her at the peak of her power.
The peak of her power is building, traveling, issuing nishans, and high point of political machinations that are going on in the court. And I will refer to one incredible one, which becomes the reason why we have lost her to history. And that is 1626, in which Jahangir is captured by one of his noblemen. We don't know why he was captured, a man called Mahabad Khan, what his ambitions were. It's a very complicated story. The important point is somehow he neglects to take Nur Jahan. So she gathers her men, she rides on an elephant, strategizes, leads a war, loses to begin with, but strategizes again, and after 100 days, rescues the emperor. 2 things happen. Immediately after 1626, in every record of the time, we begin to hear the word fitna. Used for the first time in Islamic history when Aisha, Prophet Muhammad's wife, goes on what is called as the Battle of Camel against Ali. And that's the first time the word fitna is used, which essentially means chaotic, destructor, sower of dissension, and really over time this becomes the legacy. And the 1622, 4 years before
What do you mean by that? Because she's rescued the emperor. Why is that chaotic?
But the court, so this is a very hard thing for, it seems, for the courtiers to digest. Issuing coins is okay, having a fitna-like portrait is okay, even coming to the balconies is fine. But going on the battle, army like men, really crossing the boundaries was not,
So there's a stirring of orthodox disapproval about the power of this woman.
That's it.
So what happens to her when her stepson, Harem, the future Shah Jahan, seizes power?
So they were very closely aligned to begin with, till 1622, when she marries her only daughter to the only left Mughal prince, Shahryar. And that is the very time when Khurram, Shah Jahan, goes into rebellion against Jahangir and Nur Jahan. And according to many, many chroniclers, it's a moment of insecurity for him because he had imagined that Nur Jahan would back him. But of course, Nur Jahan had her own ambitions. Part of thinking about this character is also the vulnerability of Nur Jahan in this incredibly feudal and male world. One reviewer who loved the book in The Telegraph wrote, by God, she's surrounded by a hell of a lot of women, by a hell of a lot of men. And I thought to myself that, yes, that's right. That is the ethics of that, society. And the moment Jahangir passes away in 1627, her brother goes against her, calls Khurram from the Deccan, and they imprison her.
And what is the measure of her imprisonment? Is it a very luxurious imprisonment where she has some power, or is she totally excluded from the picture?
Well, the thing is, we do not know exactly where she is imprisoned. They are on their way from Kabul to Lahore. So Jahangir is already dead. And there are 2, you're making me give up the whole book. But But they're really two parallel caravans that head. And the next thing we find, the interesting thing is she's not taken captive afterwards. And even more, she doesn't go to the harem of Shah Jahan or to her brother, where she'll have been welcomed as a senior counselor and an advisor, as other women had done. Instead, she is an inheritor of great wealth. She's a Nawab. And there's huge amount. She also inherits her father's property, not her older brother. So she establishes her own mansion outside Lahore, builds Jahangir's tomb, and also builds her own
On the same
tomb.
model, really, as her father's tomb.
That's right.
Yeah. So the end of her days is spent somewhere like Attock, maybe, halfway between Lahore and Kabul, or.
I would think in a variety of places. I was saying yesterday that one of the things in a classic vision of biography, we are expected to begin from birth, to the high point, and then kill the subject. Well, I refuse to kill her. In the last chapter that I call Beyond 1627, I play with the idea of beyond. What are the inspirations? Who were the people who were following her, such as her grandniece in the architectural vision, but her own life? If there was one thing that her life suggested all the way through, this is a woman in modern parlance, constantly rolled up her sleeves and got about doing things. And I believe that's exactly what she'll have done. She'll have, lived in her mansion, advised people, done things. Her daughter and granddaughter go with her. And
does she have any influence on Shah Jahan once he's ensconced, or is she out of the picture effectively politically?
In terms of active participation, we don't hear about this. But then I'm one of those historians who feels that if the documents don't survive, it doesn't mean that didn't happen, right? So, which is why beyond 1627, which is why in South Asia we are obsessed with her story. I mean, she's a household name.
And she's buried in her own tomb.
In her own tomb. Which
now separated by a railway track from Jahangir.
Yes, from the 18th century. But also the lower part of the tomb at some point had been submerged in water, and now the Archaeological Survey of Pakistan has really taken this on and rethinking what to do with
you can visit it today if you go to Lahore.
Yes,
and,
to the Lahore Literary
You have to
Festival.
bump over this. There's no road to her tomb. There is to Jahangir's tomb, which is a major tourist site, but
That's right.
Nur Jahan's is over the railway track, and you have to find your way there. And there
Yes.
you can go down to the basement where her body used to lie.
Yes, that's it. Yep.
Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause, please, for Ruby Lal. We have 5 minutes for a last couple of questions. This lady in the front row is putting her finger straight up.
Question about the relationship between Nur Jahan and her niece. Mumtaz Mahal is married to Shah Jahan.
That's right.
You mentioned this, but this could be her machination to continue her influence in the life of Shah Jahan.
That's right. I didn't mention her here, but she is, in many, many pages of the book. And the extraordinary thing, so I'll just relate this to legends, which are really quite, amazing sources to think about. While writing this book, I did any number of interviews in various Mughal cities and monuments. And I went to Agra, of course, and the Archaeological Survey of India team gave me access to some amazing stuff, including, one of the unbeatable and unparalleled pleasure gardens that Nur Jahan built. It's called the Noor of Shangabag. But anyway, to come back to your question, they said to me, we have a play that's being put up by the Uttar Pradesh Tourism Board, and you must come to this play. And the play is about Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal. I go to this 2.5-hour play, and the whole story was Nur Jahan. So there is this incredible way in which, she lives in our minds, in our in our psyches. And the transference is really very interesting. Who becomes what? And I think theater allows that. But really, Mumtaz is not the Mumtaz of the mother of 14 children who dies at the time of the birth of the 14th child, but really almost an empress, doing exactly the things. Now, historically, this is not right in the case of Mumtaz Mahal, but I bring this to suggest, the power, the imagination, and the love story, in a way.
Is it me?
This gentleman here at the front.
Yeah. Actually, my question was partly what Jason had just asked. That was one question. The other one was, there are legends like Anarkali. Are they true? And related to that, relationship between Nur Jahan and other niece like Jahanara.
Just explain who Anarkali is for this
Yes. Actually, the answer to the Anarkali question is very similar to the answer that I gave. There is an Anarkali tomb in Lahore.
Which is the archive now.
Sorry?
It's the archive. I've worked in it.
Yes,
Yeah,
I know.
yeah.
I know. I've seen your piece on that. But it is not the Anarkali of legend. And I believe, the first time that you hear about Anarkali legend is in the record of a man called William Finch. Not your ancestor. So, but the point that I'm trying to make is that I think that moment, historical moment, in which the love of Salim and Mihir doesn't happen, doesn't consummate, I believe that is the moment in which people will have been reflecting, well, why didn't this happen? And I think that gave rise to, this kind of legend. Your other question about Jahanara, who was the daughter of Mumtaz Mahal and the grandniece of Nur Jahan, famous architect, a Sufi princess,
Poetess.
a poetess.
Yeah, she wrote poem about Nur Jahan.
That's right, and she will have seen the regality of her great aunt. And I believe that the inspiration to inscribe her name on as male a building as a Friday mosque really comes out of, this inheritance of Nur Jahan Begum. The interesting thing is she calls herself Fakira. Yeah. That is a mystic. So there's a real irony in that inscription.
Maybe one more or not? One final one. This gentleman here. Yep. Super quick question.
Thank you very much. Mausoleums are typically the expression of the greatness of the Mughal rulers, except for Aurangzeb and Babur, who is not buried there. So how is it, and this is the question that I have, that Nur Jahan built a fantastic mausoleum for her husband and also for her brother, Asif, in the same premises, and had her a very small little thing as compared to the Jahangir mausoleum, it's not even 1%. Outside of the premises, which is almost like a broken place. It's been redone by the archaeologists, it's different. But if you compare the two, Jahangir's mausoleum and Nur Jahan's mausoleum, you won't give even 1 mark out of 100. Any explanation for this?
So are you asking the question why her tomb is so immodest? Well, I think it's...
Not immodest.
I think it's 1/3 exactly of the size.
No, it's not the size. It's also what it is made of. Today you may have seen it.
That's because today it's been robbed very badly.
Exactly.
No.
It was very magnificent once upon a time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, it was not. We have seen the original things. Now it has been redone. But original stones were still there about 50 years ago. And Jahangir's mausoleum is nothing but marble. And a huge place, not only in terms of the acreage it occupies, but also in terms of the size of the mausoleum itself.
Let me respond to this.
My question is only this. If she built the museum of her husband and her own, she selects such an austere little thing for herself?
Well, first of all, I don't agree that it's austere. 50 years ago is not, in terms of documentation, we can keep going back to time. The more critical things, it's not the size that matters, it's the philosophy of that architect. These are of the architecture. These are the only two monuments that have an open roof. Jahangir had willed that he wanted a mausoleum that did not have a roof, in that he wanted a connection with divinity. And she replicates exactly that in her mausoleum. So as in life, so in death. And I think it's exact.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Ruby Lal.